raising public awareness about technology, energy, globalism, and diversification. As part of the Think Tech series, today's show is Global Connections. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Bratton. Joining me today is Dr. Douglas Yates, who is an associate professor of political science at the American Graduate School in Paris. Today we're going to talk about the scramble for Africa's oil, talking about a lot of the repercussions in geopolitics and geoeconomics of oil in Africa. Remember that we broadcast live on the internet at 2 and 4 p.m. every weekday. All our shows are streamlined on Ustream TV and Spreaker.com. If you want links to our live streams or on our previous broadcasts, just go to thinktechhawaii.com. If you want to join us in our downtown studio for any of our shows, just write to j@thinktechhawaii.com. As I mentioned before, today we are joined by Dr. Douglas Yates, who is an associate professor of political science at the American Graduate School in Paris, and also a professor of American or Anglo law at Cergy Pontoise.
That's right. I teach both law and political science.
Okay, interesting. And so you've focused on Africa and particularly Gabon for a long time, right?
I have. For about 25 years, I've worked on the case of Gabon, which is a tiny country at the equator on the west coast of Africa, with a population of a little over 1 million people and vast oil reserves. It's a country that should have been the Kuwait of Africa, and instead most of the people in that country live on less than $2 a day.
Wow.
And there's no roads that connect the major cities. Public hospitals are few in number and frequently shut down. The schools don't run most of the year, and most of the people are unemployed. And so it raises this question, Gabon, how can a country with a small population and large oil reserves still end up being so poor?
Is this what we would term sort of an example of the so-called resource curse that many people talk about, where countries, instead of being blessed by having natural resources, actually end up being cursed, that it actually inhibits becoming a wealthy country or a developed country?
Yeah, there's a research paradigm that was founded probably in the 1980s under a man called Alan Gelb, who said, is oil a blessing? Or is it a curse? And he was looking at the effects of the oil windfall when oil prices skyrocketed, and where you would really think countries that sell oil would benefit, and he was showing that in fact it's a curse. And what started with oil then migrated to diamonds, blood diamonds, coltan as conflict minerals in Africa, and even blood timber. And it was with blood timber that Global Witness started working in Southeast Asia. And they came over to Africa looking at blood timber in Liberia, and they ended up exploring conflict minerals and extractive industries. And they find that countries that have a preponderance of raw materials that are fungible, high in value, are countries that are more prone to violent conflict. 38% of the countries in Africa that are resource dependent are also in various states of war.
Interesting. So if we're talking about oil in Africa, I know generally speaking in the U.S. we have a kind of a stereotype about, okay, oil comes from, West Asia or the Middle East, or some of it comes from, Southeast Asia or Venezuela. But Africa, up until recently, has not been an area that many people in the U.S. in the popular imagination thought of as an oil-producing area. What are the countries, the regions in Africa that are known for having large amounts of oil?
Well, a term that used to be used to refer to a specific area, but now refers to this oil region in Africa, is the Gulf of Guinea. If you picture the big bulge in West Africa, as it curves down into Central Africa, it's not a bay, but a gulf. And the Gulf of Guinea stretches from Angola in the south, major oil producer, particularly offshore. It's the El Dorado of the oil industry in Africa, Angola. And then you move up through Congo, Brazzaville, Gabon, and you begin to move towards Nigeria, which is, of course, the biggest producer, has the largest reserves. But there are many small countries, new players, that have also been explored during the scramble for Africa, and that's what this book is about. The scramble for Africa literally means a period between 1887 and 1914, when the European powers pushed from the coastal enclaves, many of which they had held for centuries, into the interior. And what's been occurring for the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, is that all kinds of other actors have pushed into the interior. So we have new producers like Uganda, where an Irish company, Tullow, produces the oil. We've got, of course, Chad, which entered in with its famous project with the Doba-Kribi pipeline with Cameroon. We have oil in Niger, oil in Mauritania. We have new gas finds as well that have been occurring along the whole East African strain. And this has attracted new actors. China, India, Malaysia, actors from the Indian Ocean. Traditionally, African oil was on West Africa, it was in the Gulf of Guinea, and it was dominated by Europeans. But now the scramble for Africa has brought in people from all around the world, and it's creating an intensification of the problems of the oil curse.
Okay. I mean, one of the things, in a sense, I find there's sort of many paradoxes or perhaps ironies here, because on the one hand, we have the original kind of irony of the resource curse, where you think finding natural resources would help for development. And then I would maybe perhaps dovetail with that with the sort of the thought people had 20 years ago that one of the problems of the lack of economic development or problems in Africa is because nobody cared. Everyone ignored Africa or something like this. So, you know, a lot of the pundits, I remember reading these Economist articles, 5 or 6 or 8 years ago, talking about how this renewed interest in Africa would help people in Africa, help development, help stabilize or have political development and democracy and all the good things that are supposed to happen when you read an Economist article, if you will. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, and that's not what you indicate in your book, that just as the same as the resources have not helped the democracy building or the development of these countries, the intense interest from the outside world has not necessarily helped these countries either.
Yeah, at the end of the Cold War, the United States began to play a large role in trying to promote democracy and capitalist development in Africa. And for about 10 years, this became the norm. Africa experienced the famous third wave of democratization, beginning with South Africa's one man, one vote and Nelson Mandela, and still going on. Last year, there were a dozen elections, presidential and legislative elections, on the African continent. And so this created systems, democracies, which we can understand, and we can see things like corruption or a bad election or keeping the opposition from running, because they're doing politics in ways that are familiar to us. But the standard regime that relies on oil, right, because only 2 of those are democracies in Africa. The standard regime that relies on oil is rather ruled by a man who's been in power on average over 30 years.
30 years.
He often runs a one-party regime, or he allows multi-partyism to exist, but his party always dominates the legislature. Since he's been in power for decades, he's made all of the key appointments in the civil service and the military, and he often transfers power to his children. So in the case of Gabon, after 42 years of Omar Bongo living on oil reserves with a one-party regime, his party, the PDG, when he died, his son took over. And the opposition boycotted the elections, and the PDG has 98% of the seats. So our democratic tools don't work for us to analyze these regimes. We have to look at them as authoritarian regimes. Some of them are military regimes, like Chad, which basically is run by a man who came to power by coup d'etat and who has warded off 3 successive attempts to overthrow him. He's a military ruler in civilian uniform. To ethnic rulers, like in Equatorial Guinea, where a monstrous, criminal regime has terrorized the population, to more tame civilian governments by men who had come to power through coup d'etat, but who over decades built cults of personality around themselves. So there's very colorful figures, and there are, of course, some of these regimes are full of atrocities, but for the most part, they're corrupt oil regimes that service the interests of foreign multinationals. And so we don't intervene from the outside. They're serving our corporate interests.
Okay, interesting. I'd heard you mention about the structure of these governments. I'd maybe go back to one that you mentioned, Equatorial Guinea. I mean, I'd heard often sometimes in the NGO world or sometimes in the pundit world, people refer to it as dictatorial Guinea to describe the political system there, which is not, and to be honest, it's not a country that most Americans are aware of or could find on a map, and it's kind of hard to find even if you're looking at a map of Africa. It's a relatively small country. I mean, how does, if you were to take that as an example of how this works, or if I'm permitted to use that term, how this works, the oil curse and the oil regime. I mean, how does a government in Equatorial Guinea maintain its authoritarian control because of oil?
The first thing that big oil money, billions of dollars of oil money does for a government is it liberates them from needing to rely on their people. That is, all of their revenues, their wealth, their weapons, their external support comes in the form of oil rent. And so the state becomes what's called a rentier state. This is a state that depends on oil. Now, the economy might depend on something else, but we can measure what percentage of government revenue comes from oil, and in a rentier state, it tends to be about 90%. So they don't need to tax. If the people boycott them in any way or attempt to sanction them, they have no impact. Now, since they won't give representation to the people, the way that politics occurs is through distributing, allocating oil money. So there's always politics, even in an authoritarian regime. There's politics. Things have to function, and so you have a system in Equatorial Guinea where one clan called the Clan de Mongamo, they're from the western district of the onshore region called Bada, deep in the equatorial rainforest, and they're from the ethnic group called the Fang. They all speak Fang. They all have Fang names. And they managed at independence of this country. It became decolonized in 1968 from Spain, from fascist Spain. They managed to negotiate with General Franco a new constitution, and which gave tremendous presidential powers to one of their clan members, and he proceeded to name his cousins, his second cousins, his brothers-in-laws, and his sisters to all of the government posts. This clan has dominated Equatorial Guinea since independence. Now, what changed was when oil came in 1979. At that point, those who were at the top of the pyramid began to acquire vast fortunes. So the ruler, Obiang Nguema, is his name, has vast fortunes in America, in France, in Spain, in Switzerland, around the world. This is money that never really touched the country. The oil left the country, but the money was deposited in banks. His son, who is being investigated now by United States authorities, had a mansion in Malibu, would collect expensive cars, but there was no ability for them to account for where the money came from. So when we look now, Equatorial Guinea has produced billions and billions of dollars of oil revenue. We go, where'd it go? And this is, of course, the problem with these political systems, is that when the oil money comes, this kind of system is not going to channel oil revenues to social and economic development. They're going to act like a drug cartel, and they're going to spend their money on conspicuous consumption and invidious consumption of goods and displays of wealth and diamonds and sports cars. And the people in Equatorial Guinea remain in tremendous poverty. But it's worse than that. Because in order to change things there, you need to get rid of this regime. And that would involve external actors. And because our oil companies do business with this government, he gets invited to the White House. He gets invited to the Elysee. He gets to see the Prime Minister of Britain. His children go to the best private schools that the First World can offer. So the external community could do a lot about this small country. It wouldn't take a great deal to change this regime, but instead they collaborate. And the key to understanding these regimes is that they only need to make the oil industry work, the presidential palace, and the national oil company. The rest of the government services, they leave to fallow. And so they're known as successful failed states.
It's almost, if I'm permitted to make a bad analogy, it almost reminds me, if I take on a sort of Charles Tilley framework, sort of a lot of your medieval to sort of Renaissance European states, where the state essentially exists for securing resources, in that case taxation, and then putting forward those resources in terms of the security sector, in terms of having coercive powers. So it seems there's perhaps an analogy where all they're maintaining with the oil wealth is their own personal positions, and then the infrastructure for the oil, and then security forces to stay in power, and then everything else, postal services, roads, or the medical system can just sort of doesn't. It's not important in a sense. They're not dependent upon the loyalty of the people. They just need to have the oil money.
What I really like about community television is that you can speak of people like Charles Tilley and not have someone sitting cut. Charles Tilley's an excellent way of analyzing how states form. His famous maxim was, the state is war and war is the state. And he saw states as developing in the 17th century as war machines, and therefore needing resources from the people and offering the people services in exchange. And this cycle of taxation and war developed the modern nation state. Now in Africa, these are all post-colonial states. They suddenly got independence. They were given external models, and they weren't very sustainable. Some of them have fought in war, but usually war in these countries is civil war, internal war, not the kind of war that Tillet was showing as expanding the state. Now, many of these countries are, of course, still in states of war. So it's a very skewed sample. Oil countries in Africa tend to have some kind of secessionist movement or independence movements or ethno-nationalist movements, and the states therefore channel a lot of oil revenues into fighting war. Notice in Charles Tilly's formula, the state needs to go to the society to raise revenues. In these countries, the state goes to the oil company to get the revenues.
Interesting.
And so you don't get that positive cycle of the war builds the state.
All right, we'll take a short break. I'm Patrick Bratton. This is Global Connections, the Think Tech radio series. We're talking with Dr. Douglas Yates. We'll be back in a minute, so stay tuned for more of the story on the scramble for Africa's oil.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard of Kumukuhua Theater, and when I was young I used to love watching Charlie Chan movies on Family Classic TV on Sunday afternoons. Our show at Kumukuhua that runs from August 22nd through September 22nd is called Will the Real Charlie Chan Please Stand Up? It's written by Nancy P. Moss and takes place right here in Chinatown. I really hope you'll come in and watch it. You will love it. It's everything about the movies that you loved and more. Go to kumukuhua.org to get more information and your tickets. We'll see you there.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is Think Tech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, Think Tech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is Think Tech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
We're back, we're live, we're Think Tech, and it's Global Connections in the Think Tech radio series. We're talking with Dr. Douglas Yates about the scramble for African oil. And as we've seen here, we see an actual copy of Doug's book, which is available that you can get, which just came out earlier this year, or late last year, right? Late last year. Available, I think, from Pluto Press, right?
Yeah, and Macmillan in the United States.
And it's quite a good read, and I can honestly say I have read this book. I read the whole book beforehand. Actually last year when it came out, yes. So quite interesting. We were talking about the state and Africa, and we brought in Charles Tilly, which most people don't always talk about, was a favorite author, I guess, of you as well, and about how the war made the state and state made the war in the European context. But often in perhaps a post-colonial context, and particularly a post-colonial oil state context, it's not making that next connection to build up the rest of the state revenue and so on and so forth. One of the other things I think that's been interesting that catches a lot of people's attention about African oil, particularly here in Hawaii, but elsewhere, is this sort of quote-unquote discovery, if I'm to put that into quotation marks, of China's interests in Africa. And that this has gotten a lot of attention, so much so that I remember that famous Economist article cover from about 4 years ago with calling it China's New Era of Imperialism, with this kind of funny parody cartoon of a Chinese imperialist with a pith helmet planting, the red flag in the desert, just like, Brazza did or something like this, or perhaps Kitchener or one of these, Stanley or something. If we're thinking about China in Africa and China's Africa interests, is this new? Is this something different now? Is this significant, or is this something that just commentators are talking about because everybody talks about China these days? What is the significance? Why is China interested in Africa? And is it something that's going to change the way that we conceptualize geoeconomics and geopolitics in Africa?
Well, after the first scramble for African oil, which ends kind of in World War I, the colonial system dominated Africa. Almost all of Africa were colonies. At the beginning of World War II, when Humphrey Bogart flies off into Africa with his friend, he's flying to colonies of France, of Britain, of Portugal, and of Spain. The end of that colonial era resulted in two patterns. One which was neo-colonialism. The French maintained control over their former African colonies. And the other was kind of a mercantilism, a relationship of, economic trade, but no longer colonial domination. And it's into that second pattern that China originally emerged when China became a developing country. So China didn't need African oil until it became a major consumer of oil. And as we know, China and the United States are now the two giant oil consumers. And the United States didn't need African oil until it began to run out of domestic oil and realized that its reliance on oil in the Middle East and other conventional sources could be disrupted. And so at the end of the Cold War, the United States came in and opened up a space. Here's the point. There was a neo-colonial space. In French Africa, French oil companies, Elf, now Total, dominated the oil industry. In former British colonial Africa, it was British companies like Shell in Nigeria that dominated the oil industry. At the end of the Cold War, American multinationals came in. And as they penetrated, they opened a pathway for Chinese companies, for other actors. They did this through the doctrine of free trade, through China's admission into the World Trade Organization. And China created listed, capitalized companies that Westerners could invest in, and these were listed in Hong Kong and then London, New York, and those companies went through Africa, and in the course of 10 years, they purchased capital shares. They weren't always active in the oil, but they would purchase not only crude oil, but they would make investments in the oil industry. So it was very subtle. There wasn't a Chinese presence, and then came Sudan. Sudan was a country that, of course, had oil. In the 1970s, Chevron had explored and found oil, and then the Civil War came, and Chevron's employees were hijacked and killed, and at the end of the Cold War, when the War on Terror began, Sudan became the target of U.S. sanctions.
Right.
So the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, flew to China. And the Chinese made him an offer. They said, we'll develop your oil industry, we'll make it a model industry, we'll drill it, we'll build pipelines, because the oil was located in the interior, far from the coast. And so this was a classic case study of the scramble. A new actor coming in, buying subsurface mineral rights, acquiring territory, drilling for the oil, and bringing it out by pipeline. Now, in order to do this kind of business, you need to have a stable climate. Sudan didn't have one. Sudan was a country that not only had a North-South civil war, the North, Omar al-Bashir, the South being the Sudan People's Liberation Army, but also had growing tensions in the Darfur region, in the West, and in the region, the mountainous region between the North and the South. So when the Chinese came in, they had to become complicit in the regime of Omar al-Bashir. And at a certain point, as South Sudan moved towards a referendum on independence, the West sided with South Sudan, and China sided with Sudan. And we began to see that what had been a very friendly acquisition of oil interests could turn into a matchbox. So things were settled. South Sudan got its independence. The oil has stopped flowing. But now there's a fear that China is able to do in Africa what the West used to do. The counterpart of that fear is that China is doing absolutely nothing unusual. They've been pursuing things in much the same way as Western companies had, but without the last 10 years of public policy. Things like creating funds for the future, where you take oil money and invest it in the future. Things like channeling oil into social revenues. Things like creating electoral colleges with civil society that can oversee the oil revenues and make sure that they're not corruptly stolen. China doesn't believe in those things.
Right.
And so when China develops oil in Africa, it does it without all of the conditions. And they say no strings attached. That would be the description of Chinese oil policy in Africa. And that that is a threat to the Western model. Because if you have a choice of getting money with strings or without strings, you'll always choose the latter. And this has hindered anti-corruption activists trying to work on this issue.
Would you say this is an example of, sort of the previous development or investing model was sort of the Washington Consensus, which is in addition to the economic growth, there are all these structural adjustments that have to be done that are supposed to be delivered toward democracy and human rights and the whole Western liberal sort of toolbox, if you will. And many people the past couple of years have talked about a Beijing Consensus, although whenever you talk to Chinese, they've never heard of this thing called the Beijing Consensus because only Western journalists use it as a reference point. But again, that this is an alternative developmental model, a state capitalist development model that doesn't need to have things like democracy and human rights and civil society and all the sort of other things, and that perhaps this is showing a new way, or we've already had a third way, so I guess this is a fourth way?
It's a different vision of what a good state is, and they offer an authoritarian model of governance, and which in fact describes most of these regimes. It's, however, in China, a developmental model, but the Chinese model, they don't have to change much to adapt to it, and China knows how to deal with these leaders, and so it's made it very difficult.
Interesting. How much of this, if we adopt a sort of a historical view or perhaps a longer-term view, is China been able, because for many people in the West, China's entry into Africa seems new. But if we look at China, if we look at Chinese and African relations at a longer term, there was a lot of Chinese sort of political, military advising to revolutionary regimes in the 60s and into the 70s. And then starting from the 80s and into the 90s, there was that sort of geo-economic recognition bidding that Taiwan and China were doing, and most of the developing world recognize us as the real China, and we'll build a bridge for you, and recognize us as we'll build a hospital for you and things. So is China's African oil interests been able to build upon this previous pattern of either political or economic interest in Africa, or is this really something totally new?
Well, there were Chinese relations in the Cold War era. And these relations are still remembered. So when you travel to countries in East Africa and in the region of the Great Lakes, they'll remember that the Chinese built a train. But what's different today is that you have perhaps 1 million Chinese people.
1 million.
Living in Africa. They create their own communities. They take over local commerce, so they're extremely visible. They're selling often low-cost Chinese products that put out of business local tapestries, local manufacturers. They tend to keep to themselves. And so as this Chinese colonization has occurred, Africans are now having a new experience with China that makes it qualitatively different. Africans didn't have a lot of opinions on China 20 years ago. It would be difficult to find an African who didn't have an opinion on China now. The penetration of capitalism usually explains African history fairly well. So when we needed labor, you had a couple centuries of the slave trade, and our investments in Africa corresponded to extracting slaves. And that was part of the plantation capitalist system. When Europe began to industrialize, the development of Africa focused on minerals. And of course, South Africa is the first industrialized country in the African continent, and it was around Kimberley, around gold and around diamonds. At the end of the Cold War, although there was a lot of effort to promote agriculture, if you look at where most of the United States does its trade in Africa, it's with South Africa, it's with Angola, it's with Nigeria. The AGOA, the free trade agreement that we signed, a multilateral agreement with African countries, is when you look at annually, you'll find preponderantly purchasing minerals that service industrial production, and China's part of that. And so China's serving itself to African non-renewable resources the same way we do.
Okay, interesting. How about other countries? Like, for example, I'm pretty interested myself in Indian foreign policy, and one of the things that I've seen in my visits to India over the past couple of years is a sort of a reawakening or a reigniting of a certain amount of interest in Africa. Obviously, in some ways, Indian and African ties go back a long way. Gandhi started off, after all, in South Africa, and you have this large, particularly in South Africa, but in other places as well, Indian diaspora community that exists. And then also there's that sort of third worldism, non-alignment of the 50s and the 60s that brought in some of the leaders together. And then, so do you see also perhaps now, particularly in East Africa or some of these other areas, sort of I would say perhaps, it sounds strange to say sort of an Indian penetration into Africa, but you see similar sort of
Yeah,
movement?
there's been a penetration from what we might call the Indian Ocean region, running from Malaysia all the way through the Persian Gulf. And those countries, as they amassed capital during the Cold War era and industrialized, had needs for oil, particularly automobile. I mean, let's just be clear, most of their consumption of oil is because of their lack of infrastructure. And so they're very thirsty, and the status symbol of the car is for new and developing countries is great. So what India has done is it's been involved in many of the new African oil countries. So these are countries in East Africa, these are countries in the interior region, and India has gone along by usually purchasing capital on joint consortium projects. So it's a partner. But India's been trying to build pipelines that connect it to larger resources, so the African oil will remain a marginal interest. Malaysia, however, has penetrated in a big way. Their company Petronas was instrumental in developing first Sudan's oil, working with the Chinese, and also in developing Chad's oil. And so there is money, there is capital, and there is technology coming from Southern Europe. And it's a very natural output for oil production. But the question is, when will the Africans stop selling their oil to other people, and when will they be in a position to use their own resources for their own development?
Okay, we'll tackle that giant question in just a second. Okay, we're going to take a short break. I'm Patrick Bratton. This is Global Connections, this in the ThinkTech radio series. We're talking to Dr. Douglas Yates. We'll be back in a minute. Stay tuned for more of the story.
This is ThinkTech, broadcasting on Ustream and Spreaker day and night, doing our thing on OC16 and Olelo, and uploading videos all over YouTube. See the links on thinktechhawaii.com. We're back, we're live, we're ThinkTech, and it's Global Connections on the ThinkTech radio series. We're talking about the scramble for African oil with Dr. Douglas Yates. Now, you had left us actually with a cliffhanger before our last break, because we have this resource curse in Africa. We've got all these foreign countries, foreign multinationals, sort of scrambling in like Stanley for African oil and so on and so forth. And so one of the conundrums then is, like, as you sort of hinted at right before our break, what are some things that could be done where all this wealth and resources that the different African countries have could be sort of better harnessed for their own development, for their own economic, political, and social development, rather than necessarily just making sure that the gas for my 4x4 is kind of cheaper than it was last year or something like that. I mean, what are some things that could be done perhaps both globally or internationally, and then also locally down, in the countries themselves, or even in different various social movements or something in the countries?
So when I tell people what I've been working on for this lifetime, that I work on the oil curse, and my question is, why are countries so rich in oil so poor? They go, but it's stupid. It's because of corruption. Or they say it's because they have dictators. And there's a truth in what they're saying, that the levels of corruption, which are measured by groups like Transparency International and the World Bank, are very high in this region. And so one of the things we need to do is to get some of the oil money out of the corruption and into social development. So fighting corruption. Now, how do you fight corruption? Many people believe you can't. Corruption is, of course, part of human nature. It's timeless. We find it everywhere. But the techniques that have been developed by the anti-corruption movement over the last 30 years involve creating institutions. So where one person has total discretion and is unaccountable, you get corruption. Where you have two people, and the other one can see you steal, it gets more difficult. Where you break up tasks into many stages and you get more actors involved, where you create public transparency, one of the most important things, you can actually create the end of corruption. So fighting corruption is an important part, and this is ongoing with the anti-corruption activists, including whistleblowers in these countries, people who work inside the governments who say this money was stolen by the dictator, and they often die. Transparency International every 3 years holds a conference, and they give awards to anti-corruption activists, and about half of the awards are posthumous.
Wow.
Whistleblowers who were killed for what they did. But fighting corruption is important. Another idea is to directly distribute the oil revenues to the people. That is, instead of having the state take it, since the state seems to literally take it and not give it, directly distributing the oil revenues to the population would allow people to have money that would accumulate in local areas through small commerce, have a demonstration effect in the classical Keynesian sense. Now people go, wait, come on, this is idealistic. How are you going to directly distribute oil money to people? But first of all, technically, it would be no more difficult than providing vaccines. And with money, it doesn't hurt their arm. They'll take the money, they'll get it. So it can be done. If we can distribute vaccines, we can distribute money. And also there are places where it's done, like Alaska.
Yes,
And
permanent fund dividend checks.
Permanent fund dividend checks, and in some Persian Gulf countries. So we do have examples, and of course, you can also take that money, instead of directly giving it to people, you can invest it in funds like Norway, creating enormous sovereign funds. And those allow them to live on money instead of living on oil. Now, since that is too idealistic, and I don't know any party that has on the agenda right now to directly distribute resources to the African people, as much as it could work, we need to look for models in the developing world. Because there are oil-rich countries like Norway, but they weren't in the developing world. And these post-colonial countries in Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, like East Timor, that are finding oil, they face different challenges and difficulties because the levels of social development are low. Colonialism often only built a port and infrastructure that service the needs of extractive industries, but they don't have roads, they don't have schools, they don't have hospitals, they don't have electricity in these African countries. And so channeling money into social development is a good idea, but how do you do it? So we can look at the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez came to a country that was embarrassingly rich in oil, and where most of the population lived in staggering poverty. And by creating alternative, non-state mechanisms, taking the oil revenues and going into the barrios and ghettos and building clinics for basic prenatal care and treating tropical diseases, increased the life expectancy of the Venezuelan population. Providing oil money to give to mothers who send their girls to school, they get the money if their kids go to school, promoted the level of literacy, which rose during Hugo Chavez's regime. I should use that term because I know he's a very unpopular figure. Providing free food, providing college scholarships, going and spending that money on the people, ended up allowing Hugo Chavez to increase the Human Development Index of his country by many points. He got up the life expectancy, he reduced infant mortality, and he increased literacy. So perhaps there's a model. Certainly Hugo Chavez didn't get help from the outside in following that model, so that would require leaders to do it. The most radical solution of all, and one that I've gotten in a lot of trouble with, so if the viewers are mad at me after this, I apologize in advance, is most of our efforts to fight the oil curse in Africa have involved in trying to change other people's behavior, making them less corrupt, or having the oil companies do things better, or having rebel leaders do or not do things. And rather than focusing on changing other people's behavior, one of the things that we can do is attempt simply to reduce our own consumption. If the oil is a curse and we are the consumers of that oil, then we are ultimately responsible. But the nice thing of controlling our consumption is we don't need to wait for leaders. We don't need a movement. We can find ways in our own life to stop reducing to start reducing consumption of oil. I know for some people it's going to be more difficult than for others, but eventually we will run out of oil. One way or another, the human race will not be consuming oil. And it's better, I think, to start now than wait for later. And certainly the problems of oil in Africa will seem like something of an afterthought compared to the global climatic catastrophes and the various toxicities that the oil industry is producing in our daily life.
Interesting. As I recall from reading in your book, one of the countries you look at actually has a sort of, how would we say, sort of functioning democracy in it.
Sao Tome.
Right, exactly. And are there examples there, any positive developments there where they've been able to maybe manage the resource course better than some of the other countries, or is democracy sort of not an assistance to this?
Well, what I show is that democracy is going to be necessary because you're not going to channel the revenues out of the presidential palace into social development unless democracy exists. There's no incentive for that to be done. But only 2 of the African oil exporting countries, the significant producers, are democracies, Nigeria and this small island state off the coast of Nigeria, right in the middle of the Gulf of Guinea, in the center of the oil region, Sao Tome and Principe. And what we've seen is that Nigeria, of course, had a long period of military rule. But when military rule came to an end, they've had elections, alternates of power, and since the introduction of democracy in Nigeria in this famous third wave, Nigeria has started sharing the revenues. What was just hoarded by Sani Abacha and some corrupt kleptocrats became the basis of revenue distribution to regions, to states, money being funneled back, and particularly into the Niger Delta region, and for the first time having someone from the oil-polluted Niger Delta region rise up and become president of the country. An Obama effect. Symbolism, yes, but a real measure of how democracy can get the Nigerian government to start to address the problems. But once they put out a fire in one place, there seems to be another. Nigeria has numerous problems, but democracy certainly has improved their governance of oil revenues for social development. Now, tiny Sao Tome. This is a country truly people have never heard of. It's 2 islands that had been slave entrepot and grow cocoa. There's still a delicious cocoa from Sao Tome that's prized and treasured. But once slavery had ended, these 2 islands disappeared from the world map. They were no interest to anyone. And they've found that these islands are located and have territorial waters with perhaps 6 billion barrels of oil. At $100 a barrel, that would be $600 billion. This is more money than this country has seen since independence. Now, here they have democracy, and there's a close degree of affinity. Most of the people who live on the island, they say, we're all cousins. And there's a relatedness there. It's a small island democracy, but as soon as the oil discovery was made, everyone on the island was waiting for their share of the oil revenue. And this creates this terrible rentier mentality. You stop having incentive, take initiative. You don't believe you'll get rich by working hard, but by getting access to $600 billion worth of oil revenue. That's obviously the only money of that kind that will come to the island. And the way you get that money is you capture government. And this results in corrupt elections and disputed elections and opposition who, when they lose power, also lose money. And it's not a good situation for a democracy that functions, Sao Tome.
Interesting. So, in essence, your lesson would be reduce our consumption of oil, and then in the long run, that this would actually help. If, for example, if we were to hypothetically role play that out from the African country's perspective, if they could no longer sell oil because people didn't want oil, are they, in a sense, in positions to sort of build up alternative industries or alternative economic base, or would this, somebody who disagrees, perhaps, who wants to keep owning their giant SUV, right, so they can get cheap African oil, couldn't they say, well, this will just make them worse? They won't have anything. At least they got oil now, but.
And that's where this theory is very counterintuitive. The idea that somehow if you were to win the lottery and suddenly be in possession of millions and millions of dollars, that there could be a curse, is counterintuitive. But in fact, studies of lottery winners show that most of them end up broke. Some of them end up deeply in debt because the lottery money gave the ability to borrow. But having unearned income is not a blessing. Giving vast fortunes to children will lead them into making bad decisions. So what we need and this is in the most general way, is to look at cases of countries that were producing oil, that were in the developing world, and that stopped. And one of the most famous case studies was Iran, by a Persian scholar called Hossein Mahdavi, the man who coined the phrase the rentier state. And he was writing during the time of the Shah. Iran was exporting oil and using it for development. But he said, no, this country has created a dynamic of rent dependency that's dangerous. Now, when Mossadegh came to power, and as you know, was overthrown by external forces, MI5 and possibly the CIA, he actually was going to challenge the oil companies. And so there were sanctions placed on Iran. And briefly, oil was not exported. And what Mahdavi found was interesting. He found that, Persian rugs, the beautiful rugs, he found that the textiles industry boomed.
Sure.
And that what happens is the mother of all invention is necessity. And until the countries get off this oil addiction, they're not going to have the necessity to get started on the path of development. The other kind of case to look at is the country where the oil has been exhausted. And one day or another, all of the African oil countries will run out of oil. And what you're left with was vast pollution. Rivers where you used to fish, you can't fish anymore. Fields that used to be able to grow food in, you can't grow food in it. Water you could drink, you can't drink. And that environmental catastrophe of unregulated oil pollution in the Niger Delta means that a country of 100 million people will have a hard time meeting its basic needs once the oil boom is over.
Wow. Well, I hate to end on such a negative image of that, but please, it's a very interesting book. I'd recommend anyone to read it. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, not being a person well-versed in Africa. But we're out of time, and we'll wrap it up. I'm Patrick Bratton. This is Global Connections in the Think Tech radio series. We've been talking with Dr. Douglas Yates of the American Graduate School in Paris. Thank you all for being here. Also, thank you for the KGU board operator, Leah Rodriguez, our operations officer, Jack Waters, our account executive, Patrick Leonard, our production manager, David Polona, our communications director, Chrissy Govan, and of course to the great, energetic Jay Fidel, who makes all of this possible, who somehow puts this all together. And thanks to you, our listeners, for listening. Think Tech will be back next Wednesday for our next show in our Think Tech series, so please tune in again at that time. If you want to get our daily email and social media program advisories, click the link on thinktechhawaii.com. If you'd like to be a guest, a sponsor, or a Think Tech underwriter, contact Jay at thinktechhawaii.com. Thanks so much. Remember that we live broadcast on the internet at 2 and 4 every weekday. All of our shows are streamed on ustream.tv and sprecher.com. If you want links to our live streams or previous broadcasts on YouTube, just go to the thinktechhawaii.com. Go there and to our Facebook page and tell them that you like us. And of course, we'll see you next week for more Global Connections. Aloha, everyone.